For years, Ghislaine Maxwell existed in the Epstein story as a peripheral presence, named occasionally, photographed often, but rarely confronted directly. She appeared in social settings, managed logistics, and moved comfortably within elite circles. When Epstein was alive, Maxwell was frequently described as an associate, a fixer, or facilitator. After his death, that framing collapsed. With Epstein gone, attention shifted inevitably toward the person many victims had identified as essential to his operations. The question was no longer whether Maxwell was involved, but how deeply. Maxwell's role matters because it reframes the Epstein case from a single perpetrator narrative into something broader and more organized. According to multiple victim accounts, Maxwell was not simply present. She was active, recruiting, grooming, normalizing abuse, and managing access. These allegations had existed for years. What changed after 2019 was the willingness of institutions to act on them. In July 2020, Ghislaine Maxwell was arrested by federal authorities in New Hampshire. The arrest was quiet, almost deliberate in its lack of spectacle. There were no press briefings beforehand, no public buildup. When the news broke, it signaled a shift in prosecutorial strategy. This was not a symbolic arrest. Maxwell was charged with multiple counts related to the recruitment and trafficking of minors, as well as perjury for allegedly lying under oath in earlier civil proceedings. The indictment covered conduct spanning the mid-1990s through the early 2000s, overlapping directly with the period of Epstein's abuse. Unlike Epstein's earlier cases, this prosecution focused explicitly on facilitation. The charges alleged that Maxwell had targeted vulnerable girls, gained their trust, and normalized sexualized behavior, effectively lowering resistance and increasing Epstein's access. This framing was significant because it treated the abuse not as spontaneous misconduct, but as a coordinated system. Maxwell's defense immediately contested this narrative. Her attorneys argued that she was being unfairly scapegoated for Epstein's crimes. They emphasized that Epstein was dead and could not defend himself. They suggested that the prosecution was driven by public outrage rather than evidence. But the evidence was substantial. Prosecutors relied heavily on victim testimony, corroborated by contemporaneous records, travel logs, and internal communications. The case did not hinge on a single account. It was constructed as a pattern. Multiple women described similar experiences, similar recruitment methods, similar locations, similar roles played by Maxwell. This consistency weakened claims of coincidence or fabrication. Maxwell was denied bail and held in federal custody pending trial. The decision echoed earlier concerns raised in Epstein's case: risk of flight, access to resources, and the seriousness of the charges. Her detention conditions were strict. She was placed under constant observation. Communications were limited. The system was clearly intent on avoiding a repeat of 2019. As the case moved toward trial, attention turned to a deeper question. Could the justice system succeed where it had previously failed? The prosecution of Maxwell represented an opportunity, not to undo past mistakes, but to establish accountability where it had been absent. Jury selection began in late 2021. The trial unfolded in New York federal court under intense scrutiny. Unlike Epstein's proceedings, this case was public, contested, and methodical. Victims testified in detail. They described encounters that followed a familiar script. Initial contact framed as benign, gradual boundary erosion, and eventual abuse presented as normal or expected. Maxwell's presence was central in these accounts, not passive, but directive. The defense attempted to undermine credibility. They emphasized inconsistencies. They questioned memory. They highlighted the passage of time. But time, in this case, cut both ways. The delay between abuse and prosecution was itself a product of systemic failure, a point that jurors were instructed to consider carefully. Trauma does not follow linear timelines. Silence does not imply consent. As testimony accumulated, the picture sharpened. Maxwell was not charged because Epstein had died. She was charged because evidence suggested she had played an essential role. This distinction was critical. The trial did not promise to reveal everything. It could not reconstruct every interaction or identify every participant. But it offered something that had long been missing: a public forum where allegations were tested openly. For the first time, the Epstein system was being examined without Epstein, and that examination would force uncomfortable conclusions about complicity, about normalization, and about how abuse can persist when wrapped in wealth and legitimacy. The trial of Ghislaine Maxwell was never going to deliver full closure. From the outset, it was constrained by time, by evidence, and by the absence of the central figure who had defined the case for decades. Yet despite those limitations, it became one of the most consequential legal reckonings to emerge from the Epstein scandal. What the trial offered was not completeness, but clarity. Over the course of several weeks in late 2021, federal prosecutors presented a case built primarily on survivor testimony. The courtroom became a space where patterns mattered more than spectacle. There were no dramatic confessions, no sudden revelations designed for headlines. Instead, the prosecution focused on repetition. Witness after witness described a similar process. They were young. They were vulnerable. They were approached under benign pretenses. And again, Ghislaine Maxwell was described as the person who facilitated the transition from normal interaction to abuse. The prosecution argued that Maxwell's role was essential. She was not accused of acting impulsively or opportunistically. She was accused of sustaining a system, recruiting victims, grooming them, and creating an environment in which exploitation could occur repeatedly without resistance. This framing was deliberate. By emphasizing structure over incident, prosecutors aimed to demonstrate intent. Abuse, they argued, did not happen accidentally or sporadically. It followed a consistent script, reinforced by authority, normalization, and control. The defense strategy focused on undermining credibility. Maxwell's attorneys challenged the reliability of memory, pointing to the passage of time between the alleged abuse and the trial. They emphasized inconsistencies in testimony and suggested that witnesses had been influenced by media coverage or civil litigation. They also leaned heavily on absence. No physical evidence directly linking Maxwell to abuse. No recordings. No contemporaneous criminal complaints naming her specifically. But absence, in this case, was not neutral. The prosecution countered by explaining how power operates in abusive systems. Victims do not report immediately when the abuser is wealthy, connected, and protected. Silence, they argued, was not evidence of fabrication. It was evidence of fear. The judge instructed the jury carefully on these points. Jurors were reminded that delayed reporting is common in cases involving sexual abuse, particularly when minors are involved. They were told to assess consistency across accounts, not perfection within them. As deliberations approached, the case narrowed to its core question. Was Ghislaine Maxwell a knowing participant in the exploitation of minors? In December 2021, the jury delivered its answer. Maxwell was found guilty on multiple counts, including conspiracy to entice minors to travel for illegal sexual activity and transporting a minor for the purpose of criminal sexual activity. She was acquitted on one count, underscoring that the verdict was not symbolic or automatic, but selective. The conviction marked a rare outcome in a case defined by avoidance. For the first time, someone directly associated with Epstein's crimes faced meaningful criminal consequences. In June 2022, Maxwell was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. The judge cited the seriousness of the offenses, the duration of the abuse, and the lasting harm inflicted on victims. The sentence reflected an attempt to impose accountability where it had long been absent. Yet, even at sentencing, the limits of justice were clear. The trial did not identify every individual who had interacted with Epstein's network. It did not expose the full scope of facilitation. It did not resolve questions about institutional complicity. Maxwell was held responsible for her actions, but the system that enabled those actions remained largely intact. This tension defines the legacy of the Maxwell case. On one hand, it demonstrated that accountability was possible even years later, even against someone with wealth and social standing. On the other, it highlighted how partial that accountability can be. Many victims never testified. Many potential witnesses were never called. Many questions were left unanswered. Why were early warnings ignored? Why were prosecutors allowed to negotiate in secrecy? Why did oversight mechanisms fail repeatedly? The trial did not address these questions directly. Courts are designed to determine guilt within narrow parameters, not to interrogate systemic failure. And yet, the implications were unavoidable. Maxwell's conviction forced a reassessment of the Epstein narrative. It confirmed that the abuse was not isolated, not misunderstood, and not accidental. It validated survivor accounts that had been dismissed for years. But it also underscored a hard truth. Legal outcomes do not always align with moral responsibility. After the verdict, public attention began to fade once again. Headlines moved on. Institutional introspection slowed. The sense of unfinished business returned. The Epstein case had produced one conviction where many expected none, but had not delivered the reckoning many had hoped for. What remains is a cautionary story. A story about how systems prioritize stability over justice, about how power insulates itself, and about how accountability, when it arrives, often comes late and incomplete. Ghislaine Maxwell's conviction closed one chapter. It did not close the book. The unanswered questions remain, not because they are unknowable, but because answering them would require confronting failures that extend far beyond one defendant. And that confrontation has yet to fully occur. Even after the arrests, the trials, and the convictions, the Epstein case remains defined not by what was proven, but by what was never fully explained. For every answer that emerged, multiple new questions surfaced, lingering in the background, unresolved and deeply unsettling. At the center of these questions is the concept of a network. Jeffrey Epstein did not operate in isolation. His lifestyle, his mobility, and his ability to evade scrutiny for decades required assistance. Logistical, financial, and social. The scale of his operations made solitary action implausible. Yet the legal system, constrained by evidence and jurisdiction, never fully mapped the ecosystem that sustained him. This gap is not incidental. It is structural. Epstein's wealth provided access, but access alone does not guarantee protection. What shielded him repeatedly was proximity to influence. Lawyers, financiers, academics, politicians, and celebrities who orbited his world, sometimes casually, sometimes closely. The nature of these relationships varied widely. Some individuals appear to have been unaware of his crimes. Others likely suspected wrongdoing, but chose silence. And some, according to victim accounts and civil filings, may have actively benefited. The problem is not merely identifying names. It is understanding how normalization works within elite environments. Epstein cultivated legitimacy. He donated to prestigious institutions. He associated himself with respected intellectuals. He presented himself as a patron of science, philanthropy, and education. This legitimacy functioned as camouflage. It reframed suspicion as paranoia and discomfort as misunderstanding. In such environments, questioning behavior becomes socially costly. Doubt threatens access, funding, and reputation. As a result, silence becomes rational. One of the most persistent, unanswered questions concerns Epstein's finances. Despite public estimates of his wealth, the precise origins of his money remain opaque. His role as a financier was inconsistently documented, and his client list was never fully disclosed. This lack of transparency matters. Money leaves trails. Influence leaves patterns. Yet Epstein's financial architecture was fragmented across trusts, offshore accounts, and shell entities designed to obscure ownership and accountability. Investigators faced a maze deliberately constructed to resist scrutiny. And after Epstein's death, the incentive to pursue that maze diminished. Another unresolved issue involves law enforcement decision-making. Why were early investigations stalled or softened? Why were search warrants delayed or limited? Why were victims discouraged from formal complaints? These questions point not to a single failure, but to repeated institutional hesitations. In 2007 and 2008, federal prosecutors entered into a non-prosecution agreement that effectively shielded Epstein from broader accountability. That agreement was negotiated in secrecy, without informing victims, a violation of their legal rights. The rationale offered at the time centered on pragmatism. Prosecutors claimed that the deal ensured some form of punishment and avoided the risk of acquittal. But hindsight reframes that justification. The agreement signaled to Epstein and to those around him that consequences were negotiable, that wealth could purchase leniency, that exposure could be managed. This perception had ripple effects. After the deal, Epstein resumed many of the same behaviors, emboldened by precedent. The system had shown its limits, and he adapted accordingly. Another unanswered question concerns intelligence and surveillance. Speculation has long circulated about Epstein's potential involvement with intelligence agencies, both domestic and foreign. While no definitive proof has emerged to substantiate these claims, their persistence reflects broader discomfort. Why did Epstein maintain relationships with individuals connected to intelligence communities? Why was his travel unusually unrestricted despite known allegations? Why did certain investigations halt abruptly? The absence of answers fuels mistrust, and mistrust thrives in the space between secrecy and accountability. The Epstein network also raises questions about complicity without participation. What does it mean to benefit indirectly from a system of abuse? At what point does tolerance become endorsement? When does silence become collaboration? These questions are ethically complex and legally ambiguous. The law requires evidence of intent and action. Morality does not. Many individuals who interacted with Epstein may never face legal scrutiny. Their involvement may fall below prosecutorial thresholds while still contributing to harm. This disconnect highlights a broader issue. Justice systems are not designed to address diffuse responsibility. They prosecute individuals, not cultures. Yet the Epstein case was as much about culture as it was about crime. A culture that rewarded access over accountability. A culture that dismissed young victims as unreliable. A culture that trusted credentials more than testimony. The network thrived because it was invisible by design. It did not rely on secrecy alone, but on plausibility, on the assumption that no one would question the behavior of powerful men in private spaces, on the belief that institutions would protect themselves before protecting victims. Even after Epstein's death, efforts to expose the network faced resistance. Civil lawsuits were settled quietly. Documents were sealed or redacted. Media attention fluctuated. Each closure narrowed the scope of inquiry. The unanswered questions persist not because they lack relevance, but because pursuing them threatens entrenched interests. Full transparency would require institutional self-examination, something systems rarely undertake willingly. What remains is an incomplete picture, a network partially illuminated, but never fully revealed, a pattern acknowledged, but not dismantled, a warning recognized, but not fully acted upon. And until those unanswered questions are addressed, the Epstein case cannot be considered resolved. It remains an open file, not in courtrooms, but in public conscience. If the Epstein case exposed anything beyond criminal behavior, it exposed the mechanics of silence, how it is created, maintained, and rewarded within systems of power. Silence, in this context, was not passive. It was functional. It protected reputations. It preserved institutions. It minimized disruption. And most importantly, it shifted the burden away from those with influence and onto those without it. One of the most disturbing aspects of the Epstein network is how predictably it followed historical patterns. Powerful individuals have always relied on social insulation. Layers of lawyers, intermediaries, assistants, and gatekeepers who create distance between decision makers and consequences. Epstein understood this structure intuitively. He rarely issued direct instructions. He delegated recruitment. He outsourced logistics. This diffusion of responsibility ensured that no single individual could easily be held accountable for the full scope of the operation. When accountability is fragmented, blame becomes diluted. Victims, meanwhile, faced a radically different reality. Their experiences were isolated, personal, and emotionally overwhelming. They lacked resources, credibility in the eyes of authorities, and protection from retaliation. The imbalance was absolute. For years, victims reported feeling as though they were speaking into a void, not because no one heard them, but because acknowledging their testimony would have required action, and action would have disrupted powerful arrangements. In such systems, disbelief becomes convenient. The media played a complicated role in sustaining this silence. While investigative journalists eventually exposed key elements of Epstein's crimes, early coverage was sporadic and cautious. Editors weighed legal risk against public interest. Stories were softened, delayed, or abandoned entirely due to pressure from legal teams and advertisers. This hesitation was not malicious, but structural. Large media organizations operate within constraints. When subjects possess vast legal resources, the cost of confrontation increases. And when allegations involve elite social circles, access journalism discourages aggressive reporting. As a result, truth becomes negotiable. Even after Epstein's death, revelations emerged slowly. Court documents unsealed years later hinted at deeper connections, yet many names remained contextless. Mentioned but unexplained, referenced but not examined. This ambiguity served a purpose. Without narrative clarity, accountability loses momentum. Public outrage dissipates. Attention shifts elsewhere, and the system resets. Another unresolved dimension involves deterrence. What message does the Epstein case send? On the surface, it appears to affirm that no one is untouchable. Epstein was arrested, charged, and exposed. But the deeper lesson is more ambiguous. He avoided meaningful punishment for decades. His wealth remained largely intact. His network endured beyond his death. For many observers, the conclusion is not reassuring. It suggests that consequences, when they arrive, may be incomplete and delayed, and that for some, delay itself is a form of victory. This perception erodes trust. Trust in justice systems. Trust in institutions. Trust in the idea that truth will eventually prevail. When trust erodes, cynicism replaces accountability. People disengage, assuming that outcomes are predetermined by power rather than principle. The Epstein case did not create this cynicism, it confirmed it. There is also the question of reform. In the aftermath, laws were adjusted. Prosecutorial transparency was emphasized. Victims' rights were reaffirmed. But reforms tend to address symptoms rather than structures. The deeper structure, concentration of power without oversight, remains largely intact. Private wealth still buys privacy. Elite spaces still operate beyond public scrutiny. Institutions still prioritize stability over exposure. Without systemic change, future Epsteins remain plausible and perhaps inevitable. The final cost of not knowing, of unanswered questions and incomplete accountability, is cultural. It normalizes doubt over certainty. It replaces justice with speculation. It teaches victims that truth may not be enough. And it teaches perpetrators that ambiguity is survivable. The Epstein case lingers not because of its sensational elements, but because it reflects a broader failure, the inability of modern systems to confront abuse when it originates within their own ranks. It forces an uncomfortable recognition that the greatest threat to justice is not secrecy, but complicity disguised as caution. Until that dynamic changes, the story does not truly end. It simply pauses. On August 10th, 2019, Jeffrey Epstein was found dead in his cell at the Metropolitan Correctional Center in New York. The official ruling was suicide by hanging. Within hours, the announcement triggered global skepticism. The disbelief was immediate and widespread. Epstein was not an ordinary inmate. He was the central figure in one of the most consequential criminal cases involving wealth, power, and sexual exploitation in modern history. His death occurred while he was awaiting trial, a trial that threatened to expose not only his crimes, but the network surrounding him. The timing alone was enough to provoke doubt. Epstein had been removed from suicide watch days earlier, despite a reported prior incident in his cell. Standard protocols were allegedly not followed. Surveillance caméra mal fonctionnait. Guards failed to perform required checks. Each detail, individually, might be explainable. Together, they formed a pattern that was difficult to ignore. The official narrative emphasized procedural failure rather than malicious intent. According to investigations, the guards assigned to Epstein's unit fell asleep and falsified records. The facility itself was understaffed and underfunded. These explanations framed the death as the result of negligence, a system stretched beyond capacity. But negligence on this scale raises its own questions. How did multiple safeguards fail simultaneously? Why were the most basic monitoring procedures abandoned? And why did these failures occur in the case of the most high-profile detainee in the country? The absence of clear answers allowed alternative explanations to flourish. Public discourse fractured into competing narratives. Some accepted the suicide ruling, viewing it as the tragic but plausible end of a disgraced man facing inevitable conviction. Others suspected foul play, believing that Epstein's death conveniently protected powerful individuals from exposure. The truth remains contested, not because evidence definitively supports conspiracy, but because institutional transparency was insufficient to eliminate doubt. Trust had already been eroded. For years, Epstein had evaded justice through opaque legal agreements and preferential treatment. His death fit seamlessly into a broader pattern of unaccountability. In this context, skepticism was not irrational, it was learned. The medical findings further complicated matters. The autopsy revealed fractures in Epstein's neck bones, injuries that some experts associated more commonly with strangulation than with hanging. While such fractures can occur in suicides, the ambiguity fueled further speculation. Conflicting expert opinions were publicly aired, each reinforcing uncertainty rather than clarity. The justice system's response did little to restore confidence. Internal investigations were slow. Disciplinary actions were limited. No senior officials faced significant consequences. The system appeared to close ranks. Epstein's death marked a turning point, not legally but symbolically. With the defendant gone, the criminal case against him ended. There would be no trial, no cross-examination, no sworn testimony. The opportunity to publicly reconstruct his crimes and connections vanished overnight. For victims, this loss was profound. Many had waited years to confront Epstein in court. His death denied them that moment. Civil litigation continued, but it lacked the visibility and force of a criminal proceeding. Justice became abstract. The narrative shifted from accountability to speculation. Media coverage focused increasingly on the circumstances of Epstein's death rather than the substance of his crimes. This shift benefited those who feared exposure. Without Epstein alive, responsibility fragmented further. Blame diffused. The central figure was gone, leaving only peripheral actors, many of whom denied wrongdoing or claimed ignorance. The system, once again, avoided comprehensive reckoning. Epstein's death also revealed how fragile institutional credibility had become. Official statements were met with skepticism. Investigative conclusions were questioned. Even verified facts were contested. In such environments, truth competes with narrative rather than prevailing over it. The phrase "Epstein didn't kill himself" evolved from suspicion into cultural shorthand, a symbol of distrust toward elite accountability. It became a meme, a slogan, a protest against perceived impunity. While often treated humorously, its persistence reflected serious concerns. It was not merely about Epstein. It was about belief in systems meant to deliver justice. The failure to provide definitive answers transformed his death into a permanent, unresolved symbol. Regardless of the factual reality, the perception of secrecy and incompetence hardened into conviction for many. In perception, in public trust, matters as much as truth. Epstein's death closed a legal case, but opened a broader crisis, a crisis of confidence. It forced society to confront uncomfortable questions about whether justice can function when power is concentrated and accountability is optional. The collapse of the official narrative did not occur because it was necessarily false, but because it was insufficient. It asked for trust where trust had already been exhausted. Many had waited years to confront Epstein in court. His death denied them that moment. Civil litigation continued, but it lacked the visibility and force of a criminal proceeding. Justice became abstract. The narrative shifted from accountability to speculation. Media coverage focused increasingly on the circumstances of Epstein's death rather than the substance of his crimes. This shift benefited those who feared exposure. Without Epstein alive, responsibility fragmented further. Blame diffused. The central figure was gone, leaving only peripheral actors, many of whom denied wrongdoing or claimed ignorance. The system, once again, avoided comprehensive reckoning. Epstein's death also revealed how fragile institutional credibility had become. Official statements were met with skepticism. Investigative conclusions were questioned. Even verified facts were contested. In such environments, truth competes with narrative rather than prevailing over it. The phrase "Epstein didn't kill himself" evolved from suspicion into cultural shorthand, a symbol of distrust toward elite accountability. It became a meme, a slogan, a protest against perceived impunity. While often treated humorously, its persistence reflected serious concerns. It was not merely about Epstein. It was about belief in systems meant to deliver justice. Jeffrey Epstein's death did not bring closure. Instead, it created a vacuum, legal, moral, and cultural, that no investigation has fully managed to fill. Legally, the immediate consequence was simple and devastating. The criminal case against Epstein ended. Under U.S. law, prosecution cannot continue against a deceased defendant. Years of preparation, evidence collection, and witness coordination became irrelevant overnight. The system lost its central target. For prosecutors, this meant that the opportunity to compel testimony, negotiate plea deals, or expose networks through trial procedures disappeared. Trials are not only mechanisms for punishment, they are mechanisms for disclosure. Without one, much of the truth remains buried. Civil lawsuits, however, continued. Victims redirected their efforts toward Epstein's estate and toward individuals and institutions alleged to have enabled his abuse. These cases resulted in financial settlements, including a compensation fund that paid hundreds of millions of dollars to victims. While these settlements provided material relief, they did not deliver public accountability. Settlements are negotiated behind closed doors. They involve no admission of guilt. They generate no formal record of responsibility. Justice, once again, became private rather than public. The estate itself became a focal point of controversy. Despite Epstein's crimes, his wealth remained largely intact at the time of his death. Legal battles centered not on whether victims deserved compensation, that was broadly acknowledged, but on how much information would be revealed in the process. Every disclosure carried risk. Documents filed in civil court hinted at associations, travel logs, and communications involving powerful figures. Yet many names appeared without context, leaving interpretation open and responsibility undefined. This ambiguity protected the system. Institutions linked to Epstein faced scrutiny but largely avoided structural consequences. Universities returned donations quietly. Organizations issued statements distancing themselves. Few conducted comprehensive internal investigations or acknowledged systemic failures. The response was reputational management, not reform. Politically, Epstein's death intensified polarization. Competing factions weaponized the case to advance broader narratives about corruption, elite impunity, and institutional decay. Facts were selectively emphasized. Speculation filled gaps left by incomplete information. The case became symbolic rather than evidentiary. This shift had consequences. When public discourse moves from evidence to belief, accountability weakens. Investigative rigor is replaced by suspicion. And suspicion, while emotionally satisfying, rarely produces structural change. Culturally, Epstein's death crystallized a growing sense that justice systems operate differently depending on status. The idea that powerful individuals play by separate rules, long present in public consciousness, was no longer abstract. It felt confirmed. The phrase associated with Epstein's death persisted not because it offered answers, but because it expressed frustration. It articulated a collective recognition that something fundamental had failed. People did not demand certainty. They demanded credibility. And credibility was absent. The most damaging legacy of Epstein's death may not be the unanswered questions themselves, but the normalization of doubt. When institutions repeatedly fail to demonstrate transparency, skepticism becomes default. In such environments, even truthful explanations struggle to be believed. This erosion of trust has long-term implications. It affects how victims report crimes, how juries evaluate evidence, and how citizens perceive authority. Once lost, trust is difficult to restore, especially when failures involve the protection of power. The Epstein case also revealed how fragile accountability becomes when it relies on a single individual. By concentrating legal responsibility on Epstein alone, the system avoided confronting the broader ecosystem that enabled him. When he died, that ecosystem remained. No comprehensive commission was formed. No independent inquiry mapped the full network. No binding reforms addressed the structural vulnerabilities exposed. The moment passed. This does not mean nothing changed. Awareness increased. Victims were believed more readily. Journalistic standards evolved. But change was incremental, not transformative. And incremental change struggles to match systemic failure. Epstein's death ensured that the most important questions would remain unresolved. Who else was involved? Who enabled, ignored, or protected him? And why did it take so long for consequences to arrive? These questions persist because they implicate more than one man. They implicate institutions, incentives, and values. The case did not end with Epstein's death. It simply lost its focal point. What remains is a story without resolution, a reminder that justice delayed can become justice denied, and that accountability, once compromised, rarely repairs itself automatically. Epstein is gone. The system that enabled him is not. And until that system is confronted directly, the case will never truly be closed. While Jeffrey Epstein was the public face of the crimes, the structure that sustained them relied on intermediaries. Among these figures, none was more central than Ghislaine Maxwell. Maxwell was not merely an associate. She was an organizer, a facilitator, and, according to multiple testimonies, a primary architect of recruitment. Her role transformed Epstein's abuse from opportunistic misconduct into a repeatable system. This distinction matters. Systems do not function on impulse. They require coordination, trust, and continuity. Maxwell provided all three. Born into wealth and influence, Ghislaine Maxwell occupied a social position that allowed her to move seamlessly between elite environments and vulnerable spaces. She spoke the language of power fluently, and she understood how to disarm suspicion. Her proximity to Epstein was not hidden. She was a constant presence at residences, on private flights, and at social events. To outsiders, she appeared as a partner, a gatekeeper, and a legitimizing force. This visibility served a purpose. Maxwell normalized Epstein's environment. Her presence signaled safety. For young girls entering his orbit, she was often the first point of contact. The person who framed expectations, minimized boundaries, and redefined exploitation as opportunity. Recruitment followed a consistent pattern. Girls were approached through casual interactions, often at schools, malls, or through social networks. They were offered money for massages, tutoring, or vague assistance. The framing was deliberately ambiguous, allowing gradual escalation. Maxwell was instrumental in this process. According to victim accounts, she trained girls on how to behave, what to wear, and how to please Epstein. She enforced silence, punished resistance, and rewarded compliance. This created a hierarchy among victims, a structure that mirrored institutional power dynamics. Control was psychological before it was physical. Victims were made to feel complicit. Payments were framed as generosity. Boundaries were blurred. Over time, the line between victim and participant was intentionally obscured, a classic tactic of coercive control. Maxwell's role extended beyond recruitment. She managed logistics. She coordinated travel. She monitored loyalty. In doing so, she reduced Epstein's exposure while increasing operational efficiency. The system became scalable. This scalability explains the duration of the abuse. Epstein's crimes persisted not because they were hidden, but because they were organized. The legal system initially failed to recognize this structure. Early investigations focused narrowly on Epstein as an individual offender. Maxwell was treated as peripheral, a companion rather than a co-conspirator. This mischaracterization delayed accountability and allowed the system to persist longer than it otherwise might have. It was only after Epstein's death that scrutiny intensified. Public attention shifted toward Maxwell as the remaining living link to the broader operation. Her arrest signaled a rare attempt to address facilitation rather than singular perpetration. But even then, the scope was limited. The charges against Maxwell focused on specific acts of recruitment and abuse involving a defined set of victims. They did not encompass the full breadth of the network she helped sustain. This limitation was strategic. Broad charges increase evidentiary burden and legal risk. Narrow charges improve the likelihood of conviction. The justice system chose certainty over comprehensiveness. As a result, the trial told only part of the story. During testimony, victims described Maxwell not as passive, but as authoritative. She was depicted as someone who exercised control, set rules, and enforced consequences. Her actions were deliberate, repeated, and systematic. These accounts dismantled the narrative of ignorance. Yet even as evidence mounted, Maxwell's defense emphasized distance. She portrayed herself as uninvolved, unaware, and misrepresented. This defense relied on the same ambiguity that had protected her for years. Ambiguity thrives in elite spaces. Social proximity does not equal legal responsibility. Presence does not equal participation unless proven. And proving intent requires more than association. This legal threshold is necessary, but it also creates blind spots. Maxwell's conviction addressed individual culpability, but did not fully illuminate institutional complicity. It punished participation without interrogating the conditions that allowed participation to flourish. The architecture of recruitment, the methods, incentives, and protections remains only partially understood. What Maxwell represents is not an anomaly, but a function. Large-scale abuse requires intermediaries. It requires individuals who translate power into access and who shield perpetrators from direct exposure. By focusing solely on Epstein, the system initially ignored this reality. By prosecuting Maxwell, it acknowledged it, but only narrowly. The broader lesson remains unresolved. That exploitation on this scale is rarely the work of one person. It is enabled by structures, rewarded by silence, and sustained by those willing to manage its operations. Maxwell was one such figure, but she was not the only one. Ghislaine Maxwell's trial was framed as a moment of reckoning, not only for her, but for the system that had allowed Epstein's crimes to persist for decades. In reality, it was a constrained confrontation, shaped as much by legal strategy as by truth-seeking. The prosecution's case focused on a specific window of time and a limited number of victims. This was not an accident. Narrow cases are easier to prove. They reduce complexity, minimize risk, and increase the likelihood of conviction. But they also reduce scope. As a result, the trial illuminated Maxwell's role in recruitment and facilitation, but it did not attempt to map the full network she operated within. The courtroom became a place of selective exposure rather than comprehensive disclosure. Victim testimony was central. Witnesses described how Maxwell positioned herself as an authority figure, someone who instructed, evaluated, and enforced behavior. She was not depicted as coerced or subordinate, but as active and deliberate. This distinction mattered to the jury. The prosecution argued that Maxwell was not merely present, but instrumental. She did not simply witness abuse. She enabled it, normalized it, and reproduced it. The defense, however, relied on fragmentation. They argued that Epstein acted independently, that memories were unreliable, that proximity did not equal participation. This strategy was not about proving innocence in a moral sense, but about introducing doubt, the threshold required to avoid conviction. In the end, the jury rejected that doubt. Maxwell was convicted on multiple counts, including sex trafficking of minors. The verdict was widely seen as a victory for victims and a rare instance of accountability beyond Epstein himself. Yet even in conviction, the limitations were clear. The trial did not name co-conspirators. It did not explore institutional failures. It did not examine how Epstein and Maxwell were protected for so long. These omissions were not failures of courage, but constraints of law. Criminal trials are not truth commissions. They are adversarial processes designed to resolve specific charges, not to produce holistic understanding. Evidence is admitted selectively. Context is narrowed. Complexity is reduced. Truth becomes functional rather than complete. Maxwell's sentencing reinforced this reality. While she received a substantial prison term, the punishment addressed her actions, not the ecosystem that rewarded them. The network remained largely intact. No broad investigations followed. No public inquiries mapped patterns of facilitation. No binding reforms addressed recruitment dynamics. The system absorbed the shock and stabilized. For many victims, this outcome was bittersweet. Maxwell's conviction validated their experiences and affirmed that what happened to them was real and criminal. But it also confirmed that accountability would stop at the edges. The deeper questions remained untouched. Who else recruited? Who else enforced silence? Who else benefited? The absence of answers reflects a broader institutional reluctance to pursue complexity when complexity implicates power. Maxwell's case became a symbolic endpoint, a way to close a chapter without reopening the book. This symbolic closure serves an important function. It restores the appearance of order. It signals that justice was delivered. It allows institutions to move forward without confronting uncomfortable truths. But appearances are not resolution. The Maxwell trial demonstrated that individual accountability is possible, but insufficient. It punished participation without dismantling structure. And structures, once established, are resilient. They adapt, they rebrand, they persist. The most unsettling implication of Maxwell's conviction is not what it revealed, but what it allowed to remain hidden. By focusing on our actions alone, the system avoided examining why those actions were tolerated, ignored, or facilitated by others. This avoidance preserves plausible deniability. It ensures that future cases can be framed as anomalies rather than symptoms. In this sense, Maxwell's conviction was both necessary and incomplete. Necessary because it affirmed that facilitators can be held responsible. Incomplete because it stopped short of systemic accountability. The Epstein case, viewed through Maxwell's trial, reveals the limits of justice when it is constrained by power, caution, and institutional self-preservation. It shows that the law can punish individuals, but struggles to confront networks. And until that gap is addressed, accountability will remain partial, visible enough to reassure, but limited enough to protect the system itself. For much of the public narrative, the Epstein case has revolved around perpetrators, enablers, and institutions. But at its core, the story belongs to the victims, individuals whose lives were altered long before the world learned Epstein's name. Their experiences did not begin with headlines. They began quietly, in isolation, and often in confusion. Most victims were young. Many were teenagers navigating unstable family environments, financial insecurity, or emotional vulnerability. These conditions were not incidental. They were the entry points. Exploitation rarely announces itself as harm. It presents as opportunity, as attention, as assistance. In the Epstein system, recruitment was framed as help. Money for school, connections, mentorship, or simply cash for tasks described as harmless. The gradual escalation blurred boundaries intentionally, making resistance more difficult with each step. For victims, recognizing abuse was not immediate. The presence of wealth distorted perception. The presence of adults normalized behavior. The presence of payment complicated consent. Over time, many victims internalized responsibility. They questioned their own memories, their own reactions, their own credibility. This self-doubt was not accidental. It was cultivated. Silence followed naturally. Speaking out carried risks. Disbelief, retaliation, legal intimidation, and social isolation. Epstein's power extended beyond physical spaces into reputational and financial domains. Victims understood, often intuitively, that confronting such power could worsen their circumstances. And for years, they were right. When victims did speak, they were frequently dismissed. Their accounts were minimized, fragmented, or reframed as misunderstandings. Authorities questioned motives. Media outlets hesitated. Institutions de fait. Each rejection reinforced silence. The psychological toll was cumulative. Trauma did not remain confined to the abuse itself. It shaped relationships, self-perception, and mental health long afterward. Many victims reported struggles with anxiety, depression, addiction, and trust. The aftermath was not a single event. It was a lifelong process. When the case resurfaced publicly in 2019, many victims faced a new challenge: visibility. Their stories were suddenly in demand. Interviews, documentaries, and legal proceedings reopened wounds that had never fully healed. Exposure offered validation, but it also extracted a cost. Recounting trauma repeatedly can be destabilizing. Each retelling requires emotional labor, and each public appearance invites scrutiny. Victims were asked not only to remember, but to justify their suffering. The burden remained uneven. While Epstein's associates retained privacy and legal protection, victims were expected to perform transparency. Their credibility was tested publicly, while institutional failures remained abstract. Even compensation carried complexity. Financial settlements acknowledged harm, but they could not restore lost time, alter trajectories, or psychological damage. Money offered support, not closure. And for some victims, compensation felt transactional, a substitute for accountability rather than a component of justice. The justice system struggles with this reality. Courts are designed to assess evidence, not healing. They measure harm in legal terms, not lived experience. As a result, victims often emerge from proceedings feeling partially recognized but fundamentally unseen. Their stories are accepted, but not fully understood. Another layer of harm emerged through comparison. Media narratives often focused on the most extreme or sensational accounts, unintentionally creating hierarchies of suffering. Victims whose experiences differed felt marginalized, questioning whether their trauma was enough to matter. This dynamic reflects a broader societal issue: the tendency to validate harm only when it fits expected narratives. Yet trauma does not follow scripts. Some victims maintained outward stability while suffering internally. Others rebuilt their lives despite persistent scars. Resilience did not negate harm, it coexisted with it. The expectation of resilience can itself be harmful. It shifts focus from accountability to adaptation, from prevention to endurance. The Epstein case exposed how systems prioritize outcomes over people. Once legal processes conclude, attention fades. Victims are left to navigate recovery largely alone. Support networks are uneven. Mental health resources are limited. Public empathy dissipates quickly. The story moves on, but for victims, it does not end. The long aftermath includes managing triggers, rebuilding trust, and renegotiating identity. It includes the knowledge that full accountability may never arrive, that some truths remain sealed, and some actors untouched. This uncertainty complicates healing. Closure, often promised, rarely materializes. Instead, victims are left with recognition without resolution, believed but not fully vindicated. The Epstein case forced society to confront exploitation, but it also revealed how poorly systems accommodate survival. Justice processes acknowledge crime, but struggle to address consequence. And until victim-centered frameworks replace perpetrator-focused narratives, this imbalance will persist. The victims did not choose this role. They did not seek visibility. They did not benefit from exposure. They endured, and their endurance remains the most overlooked dimension of the case. When victims of the Epstein network finally gained public visibility, the exposure was often framed as empowerment. In theory, telling one's story restores agency. In practice, the process is far more complicated. Public recognition does not erase trauma. It reframes it. Victims became symbols of survival, of injustice, of systemic failure. While this symbolism brought attention to their experiences, It also reduced complex lives into narratives shaped by media demand. Stories were edited for impact. Quotes were isolated. Timelines were compressed. The media ecosystem prioritizes clarity over nuance, resolution over ambiguity. Trauma, however, resists both. For many victims, media exposure introduced a second loss of control. Their experiences were no longer private, yet they remained selectively understood. Viewers consumed their pain episodically, often without engaging with its long-term consequences. Empathy became temporary. The cycle was predictable. Outrage surged, attention peaked, and then dissipated. Once headlines faded, victims were left with renewed vulnerability. Their stories public, their lives unchanged. This dynamic highlights the limits of symbolic justice. Symbolic justice acknowledges harm without restructuring the conditions that produced it. It offers validation without transformation. It reassures audiences that something was done, even when systemic issues remain intact. In the Epstein case, symbolic justice took many forms. Public apologies from institutions, quiet returns of donations, documentaries framing accountability as exposure. These gestures mattered, but they were insufficient. True justice would have required sustained investment in victim support, long-term mental health care, legal advocacy, and economic stability. Instead, assistance was fragmented and time-limited. Healing was individualized. Responsibility was not. Another consequence of exposure was scrutiny. Victims were expected to be consistent, composed, and credible at all times. Any deviation, a memory lapse, an emotional response, a perceived contradiction, was used to question authenticity. This expectation ignores how trauma affects memory and behavior. Trauma fragments recall. It distorts timelines. It complicates narrative coherence. Yet victims were judged by standards of precision rarely applied to institutions. Meanwhile, those implicated by association were granted ambiguity. Silence was interpreted as discretion. Inconsistencies were reframed as misunderstanding. Power insulated credibility. The imbalance persisted. Symbolic justice also struggles with prevention. By focusing on individual stories after harm occurs, systems avoid addressing structural vulnerabilities that enable exploitation. The conversation centers on recovery rather than reform. This focus places the burden on victims to survive rather than on institutions to change. In the Epstein case, recruitment exploited economic insecurity, social isolation, and institutional trust. Addressing these factors would require broad policy intervention, education, oversight, transparency, and accountability mechanisms. Such interventions are difficult. They disrupt existing hierarchies. Symbolism is easier. The cultural impact of the case reinforced this pattern. While awareness increased, concrete safeguards remained limited. The system learned how to respond to exposure, not how to prevent abuse. Victims noticed this. Many expressed frustration that their suffering became content rather than catalyst, that their stories were consumed but not acted upon, that attention substituted for responsibility. This recognition complicates healing. Recovery requires safety, stability, and belief, not just acknowledgement. When systems offer visibility without protection, they risk re-traumatization. The Epstein case illustrates this risk clearly. Some victims found strength in community. Shared experience reduced isolation. Collective testimony countered disbelief. These connections were meaningful and often transformative. But community emerged despite the system, not because of it. Institutional support remained inconsistent. Legal proceedings prioritized efficiency. Media cycles prioritized novelty. Once both concluded, victims navigated aftermath alone. The long-term consequences persisted quietly. Difficulty trusting authority. Hypervigilance. interrupted education or careers, chronic mental health challenges. These outcomes are rarely documented because they are not dramatic. They unfold over years, not headlines. Symbolic justice cannot account for this duration. True accountability would require sustained attention beyond verdicts and settlements. It would require institutions to measure success not by closure, but by impact. Did victims feel safer? Were vulnerabilities reduced? Did structures change? In the Epstein case, these questions remain largely unanswered. What the victims' experiences ultimately reveal is a misalignment between justice as process and justice as outcome. The system resolved cases, but it did not resolve harm. It recognized crime, but it did not restore trust. Until justice frameworks center survivor well-being rather than institutional completion, this gap will persist. Symbolism will substitute for substance. Recognition will replace reform. The victims endured exploitation, disbelief, and exposure. They adapted in the absence of protection. Their survival is not evidence of system success. It is evidence of system failure. Listening to victims changes narratives. Acting on what they reveal changes systems. The Epstein case did the former. It has yet to achieve the latter.